So we saw a little bit of this as a teaser, but let's go through it more carefully. Okay, so what are we going to talk about? We'll talk about a little bit of a review of what we talked about yesterday. We'll talk about some of the terminology that will get scattered through that's a little counterintuitive that WX-Python uses. We'll look at how one creates a WX-Python application. Then we'll talk about probably one of the weightier things, which is how one builds applications using sizers, which I think is somewhat counterintuitive. And then we'll talk about other types of widgets, and finally, in a sense, how you wire up widgets by where a widget has to do something, what you do with it. Okay, so WX-Python and GUI stuff review. So WX-Python is a good package to use. Its main competitor in my mind is something called Qt or Qt, depending on which way you want to pronounce it. Both are good. I'm not going to try to tell you one is a much better choice than the other. If you want to learn about using WX-Python, there's a book available, which is one of these things you can just sit down and read. It's not as useful as a reference as one would like, but there is a tremendous amount of material on the web that's worth looking at. And there are URLs in the previous talk. GUIs are constructed, obviously, from windows. You need to put a window up for somebody to reference it. And then you stick stuff into the window, the buttons and check boxes and all that other stuff that we're going to use. GUI code needs to be event-driven. So, example is PowerPoint. I open up PowerPoint, it does a certain amount of stuff, and then it just waits. Waits for me to open a file. Once I open a file, it sits and waits for me to do something by clicking on the mouse. And so most of the time the program is doing absolutely nothing. Just monitoring to see if the mouse has done anything, if there's anything to go on. That's called event-driven code. That's code that's responding to what you are doing, and that's how GUIs have to be written. It's a completely different way to write programs than what we normally do, where we start the program at the beginning, go to the middle, and go to the end, and then we're done. But WX-Python allows us to hide most of that in relatively easy steps. And I also mentioned yesterday that the WX-Python demo has lots of examples of WX-Python widgets, so you can go look and see how things work. And at the same time, look at short code examples that show you how to implement the stuff that they're showing you. Okay. WX-Python uses words differently than you might find in other places. First thing is the app or the application. This is the whole program. And in a sense, it's not just your program. Your program is actually sort of, in a sense, a subroutine of WX-Python, because WX-Python is going to be doing a whole lot of stuff for you. Frame. This is one of those things you can't avoid. This is what WX-Python calls what I would call a window. We won't get into this today, but modal versus non-modal windows. A modal window is one that pops up and doesn't allow you to do anything else in the application until you close that window. Hey, you've got an error, or you click on Save As in some program, and you can't do anything until you give it a file name so that it can complete the save. A non-modal window is where you have a second window that is independent, effectively, of the first. Or it may be dependent on the first, but you can operate in either window in either order. So a good example would be in Microsoft Word when you bring up two documents. You can edit in one document, click on the other window, edit in the other document, copy and paste back and forth and stuff like that. Okay, a panel. A panel is something that we stick stuff in, sort of as a convenience. We actually have to have them pretty much but there's times you can get away without them, but it's not. Okay, a frame is a window. A frame is something that if you don't have a frame, you don't have anything on the screen. Okay, a panel is something that, in a sense, fits into our window. Okay, and allows us to do things like tab between objects. You could think about it. Yep. Yes, I will. I will show that. What I won't show today, but I might later, is an example where you'll put a panel inside a panel. Okay. A case where you might want to do that would be, let's say I've got a collection of items. So I click on something and I get, if I click on option A, I get a box with 3 different check buttons. Okay. And I click on option B. Instead of getting check buttons, now I get 3 variables that I can put in. I might put each of those things into panels, and then when I want to get rid of the stuff that's there, I kill the panel, and then I create a new panel with the new stuff I want to put in. So a panel can be thought of as a container, and a frame is a window, and you have to have at least, and you don't have to, but you, practically speaking, should have at least one container to hold your stuff in the window. Okay, last thing is, and this will be probably the thing we'll spend the most time on today at least, is sizers, as a way to collect and arrange the stuff you're going to put into the window, the widgets. Okay, so let's get started writing an application. How do we do this? Okay, and I'm going to leave out the panel to begin with. But we'll come back and put that in. In order to have a WX Python application, you're going to need to have 5 things always. Okay? First thing you need to do is reference the WX library. You can't get that for free. You got to at least ask for it. Second thing is you'll need to create that application that's going to do all the WX stuff. And you need to create that before you start actually doing anything else with WX. Third thing you're going to need is and you could argue that this isn't always true, but it's so close to always being true that we could ignore the exceptions. You're going to need at least one window, so you've got to create a frame. And once you create a frame, an empty frame is not very interesting. There's not a whole lot you can do with a window that doesn't have anything in it if you're writing a GUI. So you're going to need to start putting stuff into the window. And this is where all the work comes in. And then finally, the last thing you're going to need to do is you're going to need to do a couple little bits of house cleaning and home, well, house cleaning isn't the right word, but maintenance. And then finally say, okay, I'm done with all the work before I hand over control to the user. The user can now do their stuff, and that's where you make that handoff by saying start the event loop. Okay, so here's a really short example of a truly functioning WX Python application. Okay, as I said, I have to import WX. I get to create the application. It can be as simple as that one line there. Then I need to make a frame. Making a frame can be as easy as that one line right there. Okay. Then I need to do something with that frame. So I'm just going to put some text into it. And this spread out over 2 lines, this one call over here, creates a widget, a static text widget, which is basically just a label, that thing right there. So now I've created my window, and now I'm ready to do the housekeeping. Housekeeping says, show my window. So here's the window I've created. I call a method of the window to say show it. And then I hand control off to the event loop. And you might ask, when is that print statement going to get done? And the answer is potentially never. Okay, it will not get done until this window is closed. Yes? Where do I create the window? Right here. I create the window.
No, that creates the frame.
The frame and the window are the same thing.
Oh, so where do you create the panel?
I don't. In this case, I do not create a panel.
Panel is always there, but now you created the one real example where the panel is not.
Exactly. I just wanted to make this one real simple. There's no panel here.
What does the none in the WX frame mean?
Okay. Let's see. I think that comes. I thought I have that coming up, so let me just see. Yeah, I'll come back. I will come back to why there's a none there.
Okay.
I just wanted to show you something very simple. And yeah, here I say, when we start putting multiple things in, a panel is needed. But hey, I wanted this to be really short because I want to explain two different ways of doing this for two different things. So it's really simple. It's as stripped down as you can do, pretty much. I was tempted to even leave out the static text, but as it says right there, an empty frame is boring. Okay, so any other questions? Okay. All right. There are two ways of creating the application object. Okay. One way is the method that's on top. Here I'm creating a class that that is based on the parent class for WX applications. And then I can stick all my code in here if I want to. I don't have to, but that's the way I've done that here. And so I've subclassed WX app. And if you're going to do this, this is one of those exceptions where you don't use the underscore underscore init underscore underscore. Why? Because WX Python has to do a lot of stuff to initialize itself when it's getting going, and you don't want to have access to anything until all that initialization is done. So the WX application class expects to find a routine called onInit, and it will run that for you when the time is right. So don't put code in the double underscore init. If you have initialization stuff to do, put it in onInit. However, now there probably are reasons why you may want to do this sometime, but I don't know of any. I find that I never do this. I always just make this one call to create the application. Bob, have you had any reasons why you need to subclass WX? Okay. Okay. But you don't necessarily have to do it that way. Yep. Okay. Okay. Oh, okay. Okay. Right. 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 Yeah. The advantage. It's a question of whether you want the superclass of the application. So I think this tends to be cleaner. On the other hand, now let's talk about creating the frame, which here I do right here. This is something that, again, you don't have to do as a subclass, but it's done so commonly that whenever you look at examples, you'll almost always see it done this way. And so here in this top case, I am, instead of doing this code, since at the global level, I've put it into a class. So here I create the application. Here I create a frame, and I create the frame by subclassing WX frame. And this is actually a very convenient way to do things because it allows you to move code around more easily. Here, I subclass WX frame, and as part of the init, the first thing I do is I do the initialization of the parent. Okay, of the parent class, and then I'm going to create a panel in it. Then I put my static text in, and then I show it, and now the application code is down to 3 lines, and it does exactly the same as this does. Okay, now let's see. And here I am creating my panel. And the one change that is made by adding a panel is that before you pass the name when you create in all these things of an object's parent. There's a hierarchical series of objects. The frame doesn't have a parent. The first frame that I create isn't a child to anything else. It's in the application, but it's not exactly a child of the application. The panel is inside the frame. So when I create the panel in either place, I give it the name of its parent, which is here FRM, and here it's self. And self points to that FRM. Okay. The static text is parent is the panel. So you'll see here, I pass it the name of the panel. Okay. Now this means that if I want to get rid of the static text, I can go off and I can delete that. But alternately, I can just simply delete all of the things that are in that panel by just deleting that panel. Because when I delete an object, I delete all of the things that are its children. Okay, so does that answer your question from before about why do I have none there? I have none there because this frame doesn't have a parent. And we won't do it today, but when we talk about using multiple windows, we can make one window, a frame, a child of another frame. In which case, when I delete the top one, the bottom one, the child goes away immediately. Or I can have 2 independent windows. That none is a reserved keyword in Python. None is a unspecified value. It's a placeholder for that. So, yes, none is a very important Python concept. You can, in some cases, get away with using any value you want to, that you know is not going to be recognized, that you'll recognize as being special. But this is a way to, for example, none is a value that you'll use to initialize variables to something, but a value that doesn't do anything. Okay. So, again. Subclassing frames is so commonly used. Yes? Yes, Bob. Mm-hmm. So if you say var equals none, and you say if var colon, then if var is none or 0, the test will show up as false. Actually, there's a better way to do that, which is to say, and this is somewhat obscure, but if you're going to test for something being none, it's really better to say if var space is space none. If var is none, or if var is not none, that's the better test to do. But it does work to say, it does work in some versions of Python to say if var equals none. Okay. And again, no quotes on none, because it's a keyword. If you put quotes around it, then you're talking about a string. And this will then fail because you're not allowed to pass a string as a name of an object. as a pointer to an object. Okay. So from here forward, I'm going to simplify things a little bit by just showing you the class that creates a frame. I'm not going to show you the import WX, and I'm not going to show you these lines down here. Okay? Why? I'm going to saving space on my screen so that I don't have to make the letters too small to get everything to fit. But always assume that I create a frame. First import WX. I create a class for a frame, and then I'm going to call it to create it. Okay. So let's talk about how you deal with multiple widgets. So far, we've looked at examples where we've created one widget and put it into a panel. So let's take a look at the class where I create two widgets. At the top, I'm just taking the exact same code we saw before, but I'm adding a second one. So here, I create my frame, I create my panel, I stick in a static text, and it says widget 1, and then I create a second static text, which is ... space widget 2, and then I go on from there. Okay, and what do I get? I get a window with two widgets right on top of each other, which I doubt is what anybody wanted. Well, what I really want to do is I want to see them separately. I want to put them next to each other in some fashion. And I can do that by specifying positions to put each one of these things here. And I can do that. And I say here it's a really bad idea. Why is it a really bad idea? I see Dennis nodding his head. Why is it a bad idea, Dennis? Yeah, there's all kinds of problems. Right. If I resize it, if I change the size of the font, it's not going to necessarily, the relative sizes may be different on one platform versus another. So I get this to work perfectly on Windows, and then I bring it over to the Mac, and all of a sudden everything's superimposed again, or vice versa. Also, let's say I decide that, gee, I really want widget 0 on top of widget 1. Well, now I've got to go through and I've got to change the positions of every single thing to get everything to work out. So this is a really bad way to put things done. Yes? Sure.
How do you address those static texts when they do not have a name attached to them? Because you just put two static texts in there, but you didn't call them anything.
I didn't. Right. So I can't get to them again.
So, but can you call them? Can you put in front of them names?
Oh, absolutely. 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 So I think I may have an example where I've done that. Well, here we go. Here I've assigned it to a variable. Right. Then I can do whatever I want with the BTN. If I don't need to do anything with these static texts, again, which I don't in this case, I don't need to save a reference to them. But if I want to do something with it, well, I'm talking about in terms of the design. Okay. But you're right. If I want to do something like that, I need to I need to do something like that. So, okay. So WX Python gives us a couple different ways to put things together in a way I'll call it stack up widgets. Okay. Now let's think about this process of stacking up widgets. How is that going to work? Well, in order to stack it up, we need to know how big it is. We're going to need to know, because we need to know how much space to reserve for it. We're going to need to know what order we're going to stack things up. And we're going to know about things like, do we want to leave margins? And what happens if the window gets expanded? So the basic technique for doing this is something called a sizer. So a sizer is either a vertical stack or a horizontal stack of widgets. And these are just basically boxes to put things in, and the box will change its dimensions to match the size of whatever we put into it. So this one may be very big and this one may be quite small, vice versa. Now there are more complicated types of sizers we can use, but let's use this as our starting point and take a look at how this works. So here's our code from before, and I've added a couple lines of code here to incorporate a sizer. So I've got my panel as I did before. Now I create a sizer. Sizer, by the way, doesn't have any parents, if you'll notice. All I've specified for a sizer is I want a sizer and I want it to be vertical. Okay? But then I add my sizer to the panel. I say this panel has the following sizer. So I do that by using a method of the panel, saying set its sizer to be the object that I called sizer. Okay. Then once I do that, I create my two static texts as I did before. And again, to save a little bit of space, I probably wouldn't program it this way too often. I just simply pass the name as it's created directly to the sizer and tell it add that to the sizer. Even though it's not necessary, if I were doing this in my own code, I probably would say, label equals static text, wx static text, and then I would do in the next line sizer.add parenthesis label. And then since I don't need label for anything else later, I could use it again, and I could just again say label equals static text and then sizer.add label. So I've created my sizer, and I've used the add method in the sizer to add two things to it. And that's all I need to do to get the two sizers. It's created the number of boxes it needs on the fly. It knows that it only needs 2 boxes because I've given it only 2 objects. And if I wanted these two things to be side by side, all I need to do is change that vertical to horizontal. Okay, as you'll see in the next example. So the sizer isn't all that hard. It's not all that much extra effort, and takes us where we want to go. And all I need to do is create the sizer, associate it with the panel, and then stick each widget in as I create it. I could create the widgets someplace and then stick them in later. There's no requirement that I have to stick them in as I create them. But I need to create widgets and then stick them in. Okay, so a little bit more of an example. This is a slightly more sophisticated example, but it's pretty similar. I just create 4 static texts, and that static text is contains the string A, B, wide, and then 2 followed by carriage return lines, which gives us a widget that looks like that. Okay, and when I call this, I can either pass it vertical or horizontal, and and I will come back to this fit in a second, and we get either this in the case of horizontal, or we get this in the case of vertical. Okay, but other than that, it's all the same example as we saw before, except now I've put the calls into a loop. And I'll come back to what this add does, because it's got a few more parameters in here. And the sizer.fit, okay, what this is saying is tell the sizer to fit the window to the size of the sizer. Okay, so what I have to pass it the name of the frame, which in this case is self. So what does it do? It takes my window and it reduces it to the size that it needs to be. I may or may not want to do this. I mean, in some cases you want a window of a particular size, but in most cases you want your window only to be as big as it needs to be. So that's what this does. Okay, and that's optional. I don't have to do it, but I do it in this case. Okay, so let's talk about what's going on here. I'm passing the name of the object. I've got a 0. I've got some text that we don't know exactly what that does, and then I've got a 10. What are those things doing? Well, turns out that's dealing with how the code will change, how the code deals with extra space. So here's those 4 things again. And what these things are, first thing I have to give it the name of the widget. Then I have to give it an expand value. I have to give it some flags and a border value. So widget is obviously the name of the thing that I'm adding to the sizer. Okay, let's talk about this flag field first. The flag field can be one of a number of things or a combination of those. So the first thing is expand. Do I want this widget to stay its initial size, or do I want to give it extra space if it becomes available? And if I say WX expand, the widget can expand, and if I don't, it can't. Second thing is, do I want to give borders around this widget? Do I want to give it some extra space or not? And if the choices are so I can put a border on all sides, I can put it only on the left side, the right side, the top, or the bottom, or I can combine things. And I combine things by using a bitwise OR. So if I want to say I want this to expand and I want a border on the left side and the right side, I can use this expression right here. Expand left and right, ORed together. And WX all is actually just simply an abbreviation for an OR combination of left, right, top, and bottom. So it's just you could use either one. They do exactly the same thing. Okay, so let's talk about expand. When we allow things to expand, we have to tell it what portion of the free space should it get. And this is a little bit tricky conceptually. If I give everything a 1 that I want to expand, then everything gets an equal share. If I give one of them a 2 and the rest a 1, then the one that got a 2 gets twice as much as the rest. Now you might think, hey, how about giving it a half so it gets half as much? But this parameter has to be an integer. And so a half won't work. A half gets cast as an integer, which gives you 0, so it turns off the expanding. So it gets none of the space. So just remember that expand must be an integer, so you have to use 2 and 1 rather than 1 and a half. Okay. Border specifies the number of extra pixels we want to use, but it only is going to work if we give it a border to put them on. So if I say, if I leave this out, or I set it to just expand, and I specify a border, nothing happens. So let's take a look at some examples of that previous code where I used different add versions. So this is what we started with. I add it. I use 0 for expansion. I specify put border on everything and use a 10 pixel border. And here you can see that these things are spaced around. Okay? If I change this value to 0, or I get rid of the WX all, I get this window here, where there's now no border around everything. Everything's touching. Okay? Now, if I take either of these two widgets and I drag the window to make it bigger, nothing changes here. Okay? The widgets stay exactly where they are. Actually, I shouldn't say it. If I do it on this one, no, actually, that's true. In both of these, nothing changes when I expand it. But if I take 100% of the space and give it to each widget, as I've got there, then when I drag this thing out, it takes the extra space and it gives it to every widget. Okay. What about if I use 1 here for the first widget, 2 here for the second widget, 3 here for the third widget, and 4 for the fourth widget? When I expand it out, I get more space showing up here for the last one than I get for each one before it. So this one has gotten This one has gotten 4 times as much space as this one has in terms of the expansion. Okay, and I can use these in combination. So here I've used expanding and a border. So WExpand isn't going to do anything for me until I make things bigger. Okay, or sometimes it will work because I've got other constraints, which we'll see how that might work, and I'm forced to have extra space. But in terms of a simple, for this simple example, expand does nothing until I actually change the size of the window. Okay, I can talk about this forever and show you examples forever. It won't really make sense until you play with it. But if you want to see some other examples, if you go to this web page over here on using sizers, then you can see some other examples that are worked through. Okay. Well, when you want to create a complex window, you're not just going to want a simple stack of objects. This object here, this object here, this object here. So you start putting sizers inside sizers. So here's my blue sizer. I'm going to put 3 things into the top level. Then I'm going to put a sizer inside that. So the next thing I want is a red size, is a series of red sizers. So I can stack some stuff up. So now I have 3 things across this way, 4 things across this way, and 5 things across in the bottom row. So I do that by putting a sizer inside a sizer. In this case, actually 3 sizers inside my first sizer. And then maybe I want something else, so I want to have yet another sizer inside that. So now I have my green sizer, which is inside one particular spot of my red sizer. Notice, by the way, that the sizers have alternated directions. The first sizer, the blue one, is vertical. Then the second one is horizontal. Then the third one is vertical again. No requirement, but it won't make sense to do it any other way, except that you might want to start horizontal first and then go vertical. You might do it in the opposite order. But this is at least one way to break up your window into different sections and put different things into these sections. So let's take a look at some code that actually does this. Code's a little bit complicated compared to some of the things we've seen so far. But here we have we'll go through this slowly. Here we create our frame. And the first thing we do is we create our vertical sizer. And to remind you, I've called it blue. And since it's the first sizer, I associate that sizer with the panel right here, with the set sizer. Then I'm going to do a loop. And I'm going to I'm going to create a red sizer using this class down here. And let's see, that works better. Okay. And I'll do that by calling red size, which is this routine here. And I'm going to add the red sizer as I've created to the to my blue sizers. Okay, so now I'm creating these red sizers, and they go inside the blue sizer. So let's take a look at the red sizer routine. And normally I would actually write these as 3 different routines. But if I wrote it as 3 different routines, it would be much harder to get on a slide. So to get everything here, I wrote it as a slide that does different things depending on whether we call it the first time, the second time, or the third time. So first time I call it, I label it with ABC. The second time I'm going to use the labels as BCD, but I'm also going to call the green sizer first. And then the third thing I'm going to do, third time I do it, I use labels as A through E. And then once I've done that, I create a text for each one of these labels. And I'm going to set the background color for the static text to be white, and I'm going to set the foreground color to be red because these are my red sizer. And then finally I'm going to add it. Okay. And then finally I return the name of the sizer. So that's how I get back the name of the sizer showing up as red sizer, and then I just add it. So I'm putting a sizer. So red sizer is the name of a sizer, and I'm just adding it to another sizer. Okay, and for what it's worth, expand has been set. The space has been set to 0, 0, and 1. So expand is 0 for this one, 0 for this one, and 1 for this one. Okay. So we'll see how that works. And then finally, so we can see how I got the A, B, and C here, because I have label A, B, C, went down to here, put a static text in this red sizer here. Then we'll skip over the second time through and look a little bit more about that. And then the third time through, it had 5 widgets, and it created them right there. For the second time through, I first create the green sizer by calling that, and then I create my 4 widgets, my 3 remaining widgets, which are labeled B, C, D, right there. So let's take a look at green sizer. Green sizer is expecting the name of the parent sizer and the panel. And so it creates a sizer, and it's going to put 3 widgets into it, which are labeled 1, 2, 3. And in this case, their foreground is green and their background is gray, so that I can see them stand out a little bit better. Okay, so and these get added, and this gets returned. So let's take a look at how space has been handled. So here I have an expand and a border, and so each one of these gets a border around it. For the red sizer, this green thing makes it bigger. So the expand means that I have extra space, so that's why these things are bigger than they would be otherwise. If I didn't have expand, right here, then the B would be the same size as over there. And then finally, I have the same thing here. Now, what about this value, which is, where does it go? This value here, which shows up right there. So the expansion number is 0 for this guy, 0 for this guy, and 1 for this. That comes to play if I take this window and I drag it out and make it bigger. So let's see how that happens. Okay, this is what I had before. And if I drag it out, which on the Mac you do with the corner, Windows you can do from or Linux you can do from edges, what I find is that things get bigger as they have to, but I've told it to use all of the extra available space in the red sizer for only the bottom red sizer. So as I drag it out this way, everything gets bigger, except for these guys, because they weren't set to expand at all. You can see here, the green sizer doesn't have an expand, so these guys don't stay fixed. But all of the extra space goes here. Okay, when I drag it out this way, it spreads the space around as it has to. So all of these get bigger this way. But when I drag it down this way, these things stay the same height, and all of the extra space goes that way. Confusing, isn't it? Okay. I don't know how I would make this simpler, but I know that I would like to if I could. I don't find this easy to work with. I find myself rethinking this every time I go walk away from it for a few days. But this is how it works. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Thank you for mentioning that. Here we go. I normally use a function for each sizer. It makes things a lot cleaner. Okay. Another advantage of making a separate function or method for each sizer you're going to use is that you may come back and say, you know what, I don't really want this over here. I want it over here. Or maybe even in a completely separate window, or I want to use it multiple times. All you need to do is call it where you need it. And you don't have to worry about moving code around. You're just moving that one call to where you need it. So I think it makes a lot of sense to, as I've done here, have a routine that creates the sizer that I need. And when it's done, it returns the sizer. Okay. A variant on the sizer is something called a static box sizer. To use this, you actually have to make two calls. And what that gives us is a sizer with a label on it. And the two calls are to first call static box, and then to pass that to static box sizer. And in this particular case, to save space, I've done it all in one call, where I first call static box, and then I just pass it as the first argument to static box sizer. And that just replaces the box sizer call before. And now I get a label around each of these boxes. And if I make that one change, actually it's two changes, I have to add a little bit of extra space, but other than that, replace this one call with the static box sizer, which contains the static box. Now my sizers each get a label around them, which I think looks reasonably good in Windows and doesn't look quite as good on the Mac. But it's just following the native feel. It's a nice thing to do at times when you want to alert somebody to the idea that this is a group of special things. Doesn't do anything other than help explain what's going on to the person who's using your GUI. But in terms of making a GUI transparent, it really helps to put boxes around things and to group stuff. Okay. There is another type of sizer that you can use where you want to create a table of widgets. The first one is one that I don't think I had ever found a use for, which is called a grid sizer. A grid sizer makes everything the same size. And you need to tell it how many rows and columns it's got. And then as you give it widgets, it takes the first one, puts it there, second one there, third one there, until it runs out of room, it runs out of the rows, and then it goes on to the next row. It runs out of columns. So you'll see that my biggest widget in terms of length is the first one with all the A's in it. The biggest widget in terms of height is the F's, and everything ends up being this much space wide and this much space high. Okay. There may be occasions where you want something that looks like this. And it's certainly easier to use this, probably, than to make 3 sizers inside of 1 sizer as we did before. And furthermore, if we did this with 3 sizers inside 1 sizer, these guys would have had a certain amount of space, and these one would have had different amount of space. So this gives us the table, if that's what we want. A different choice, which was one that I'm much more likely to use, is one called a flex grid sizer. Here, each column is dictated by the widest element in the column. The height of each row is dictated by the tallest item in each row. So if we compare this guy with this guy, we can see that the second time it's much more compact. But other than that, the only other difference between these two sets of code is here I called grid sizer, and here I called flex grid sizer. Other than that, these are identical, completely identical. And this is the one that I'm more likely to use, except if for some reason I really want to give people a table where I want every row and column to be exactly the same dimensions. And there is still one other type of grid sizer where instead of putting things in sequentially, you can address them by row and column, and that's called the grid bag sizer. I have no idea why they use that name. And this is actually pretty sophisticated, and I'm not going to try to give you any code to show you how it's used, but I recommend looking at the demo that's in the WX Python demo kit, because this does a lot of stuff and you can see how it works. Okay, and let's see. So that's it for sizers. Let's go on and take a look at any questions on sizers before I go on? Yeah. Mm-hmm. The answer is yes. You can do that. And for a long time I was doing that. And then certain minor things wouldn't work. As an example, let's say you've got multiple entry widgets where you type stuff in. Turns out the panel handles the tabbing between things. So the answer is, can you get rid of the panel? And the answer is yes, you can, but you don't want to. There may be some other things that I stumbled on that didn't work quite right until I started using panels. Yes? Yeah, but you can change that by using using a scrolled panel. So if you want scroll bars, you use a different. Right, but it's still a panel. Okay. Yes. Mm-hmm. I believe that case you have a panel inside a panel. Nope. Two panels? Right. 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 Well, you don't have. There's no such thing as a vertical panel and a horizontal. What you're describing is you have. Now you can possibly get away without that outer panel, just as we were talking about. But in my opinion, the right way to do what you're describing, where you have a dialog box and you want stuff in different panels, would be to make a frame, map a panel to it, and then start putting stuff into sizers, and the things you put into those sizers might be panels. And I'm not going to do that today, but I will come back with an example like that where I start putting panels inside panels. And the main reason for doing that is if you want to be able to rearrange that window on the fly. If you want to be able to do things where you either move stuff around or change things.
So is our sample grid panels
That's something different. That's a very specialized widget. The question was related to 11BM. How is a particular table where you can move things around in the table done? And
I was thinking more in terms of the horizontal behavior, not the
I don't think I want to go there.
okay.
At least not yet. Actually, you know what? Hell with that. Let me just show you. I'm going to use the demo, the WX demo, to show what we were just talking about. Okay. One thing that okay, close that. And let's see, window, zoom. The where's the grid? One very powerful widget type that WX Python offers is a table where you can move stuff around. So you could put in edit boxes and stuff like that on this. But actually, here we go. Okay, I've just changed the severity in that particular box. But you know what? Severity is the most important thing here, so let's move that as the first column. Okay, and now that I've done that, well, this row really doesn't need to be at the top, so I can do that. So you can do some pretty sophisticated things with this one widget. Does that look familiar? That's what we use on 11BM, and we actually use that as a scheduling method. What's that? You can do. I believe you can move the columns around. That's something that needs to be implemented behind the scenes, but I think I did do that. And you can also do things like this. You can go here and make that big or small. Okay. All right. So, all right. Getting back to where I so rudely interrupted myself. Okay, let's talk about some of the different widgets. And I just want to give you some very simple code that shows you how we implement some of the common easy widgets as opposed to the one I just showed you. Okay, what kinds of things you're typically going to want on your windows? Well, you're going to want buttons. You're going to want check boxes where you can check something, or you're going to want radio boxes. What's the difference between these things? Well, first of all, this, if I can check, if every check button that I put in is independent, I can check it or not check it. But a radio box, I can only check one of these three choices. And how do I generate these things? Really simple. We saw button. No, we didn't see buttons before. We saw static text. So I create a button, and then I add it. Okay. For the checkbox, I just simply, again, create it, and I add it. And for the radio box, I have to be a little bit more it's a little bit more complicated because I need to create all the elements in the radio box at the same time. If you think about it, that makes sense because it's got to hook these things up so that only one can be used at a time. If I create a second radio box, it's going to be independent of the first one.
Is there a way of creating something like a radio box where N, a subset of N can be selected?
Yes. There's another widget. I'm not going to show that, but if you want to select more than one thing, either you're going to use check buttons.
Well, I mean, a limited number, a fixed maximum of N of M.
I think you'd have to code that in. I don't know offhand of any way you could do that. Depends what kind of. It depends what you're selecting from. If you're selecting from a small finite number of things that are predefined, then check buttons are the way to go. If you're going from something where the list that you're going to be selecting from is sort of dynamic and may change from time to time or something like that, a better way to do it is with a scrollable list where you can select from the list. And in which case, let's see if I can show you how I would do that. Here we go, list box. Okay, so here's a list box where you can only select one thing at a time. Here's a list box where if I use Shift, I can select a range of things, or depending on how it's done on the platform, select or unselect things. I believe there's nothing in that code that will tell you to limit it so you can only select 3 things, up a maximum of 3 things, for example. However, we'll come back and we'll talk about how you could do that. Oops, that's there. So, okay. Now, this code is sort of brain dead. I've created the widgets, and they display very nicely, but nothing happens when I click on any of them. Okay? What's that? For ideal user code. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Okay.
We'll start requesting, I press this button and nothing happens.
Right, right. Okay. Moving forward on that note, okay, another couple things that you may want are, we saw the static text where you put a label on. You almost certainly will want at some point a text control. A text control puts a box where we can type stuff in. Again, at least at this stage with this level of code, where does that information go? How do I get to it? Right now I can't. But we'll talk about what we do to get that. And then finally, if you want to choose from a list of things, here's another way to do it. With a WX choice box, and this gives you a drop-down list. When I click on these arrows, I get a list, and I can select from that. And this is something you would use only if you want to choose one of, typically, because so again, we haven't wired any of this stuff up, but we've seen it's relatively straightforward to get it on the screen. Okay, so let's talk about how we wire stuff up. And you know what? Judging by the amount of time, I'm just going to give you a sort of a preview of how this works, and then next week we'll go through this in more depth because it's fairly sophisticated stuff. Okay. In order to work with a widget, we need to respond to an event. Simplest thing to think about right now is we create a button and we want to do something when the button gets pressed. So how do we do that? Well, we write some very simple code. Other than the stuff that's in yellow, it's just the same as what we would have done before. Create a frame, create a panel, create a sizer, put the sizer in the panel, then we create a button. But here's the new thing. We take a method of the button called bind. And then we specify an event code, and then we specify a routine to call when that event occurs. And that's all we need to do to wire up the button in terms of setting up something to respond, except that we need to write a routine to respond when the button is pressed. And that routine will be passed one argument which contains an event object. And we'll talk more about what that event object is. So now we've created some code that will print button pressed every time we click on the button. Okay? So far so good? Not hard. Not hard conceptually. Yeah.
Just one sort of tangential question.
Mm-hmm.
These things are always coming up with those 3 canonical control buttons up at the top.
Yes.
That is part of making the frame that it automatically controls those?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. The question was, at least here, I was too lazy to do. I'm too lazy to do this stuff frequently on Windows and on the Mac, so you can see it in both cases. But when you do it on the Mac, you automatically get these 3 canonical buttons, which allow you to resize the window, minimize it, kill the window, How is that managed? Well, the answer is that these are defaults, and when I create the frame, I can specify what I want, how I want my window created. And there are various options. Not everything is implemented on every platform. So you can say, I want a window with no border, and then it wouldn't even draw this part up here. I want a window that doesn't have a minimize button, so I can tell it to get rid of that. By default, it comes up like this. So if you want to see how you override that, look at the documentation for the frame, because this is the frame.
I was going to see where the support for that is, but it's automatically part of the frame.
It's automatically part of the frame. In a sense, all these things are effectively dealing with the operating system. Yeah, John?
One of the most common things, the red button kills the window, right? So if you're editing something, you may not want to kill the application before you save it. So the most common thing in most of the toolkits is to get a hook into that process.
Yeah.
Another one is if your application creates more than one frame, you may not want the user to kill some of the frames, because then the next time the application
Yeah,
tries to draw the frame,
the idea of options with them is fine. I was just wondering, that they suddenly appear,
Right.
I don't have to do anything about them in the answers unless I want to know.
Right. Another thing that you can do, and this is to give us an idea of an event, is that when you press that red button, you create an event. You can trap that event. So one possibility is you trap that event and you put up a little box that says, no, you don't. Yes, Pete.
One particular interface that John Hamilton I found, unfortunately, had a very important feature that needed to be clicked on, and it was positioned geographically right below the red button.
Mm-hmm.
So as you're defining the user interface, check it out on a platform where you're working to make sure that you don't manage to do some delicate operation right next to the display.
Right. Right. You really don't want to put the commit my changes right next to the self-destruct button.
Pretty much what it was.
Right.
If you do, make sure you trap everything.
Right. Right. At least you want an "Are you sure?" The Slytherin button. Okay. Okay. So that bind statement that we had right here, okay, can be done in 3 different ways. And I'm showing them to you. I don't suggest you use all 3 of them. As a matter of fact, I think you should only use the one that's up at the top, where you bind directly to the widget that's creating the event. That's the most clear thing. So the button that I've just created is being bound. This is the event, and this is what I want it to do. But there is another way you can do this. And this shows up in older code because it existed before this did. Here, we bind to the frame, and we specify the event, the routine, and the widget. Okay? In my mind, this is a little bit more indirect than this. I don't like it because it's that much more indirect. Okay? And then there's something that I think is just downright horrible. And it's only there. Yes? What's the really good use? What's the really good use for the second one? Third one. Okay. The third one is where you call the event and you specify the frame, the ID, which we'll come back to, of the button, and then the routine. Okay? And this was originally the way that binding had to be done. So you'll see this in really old code. And until Bob enlightens us, I don't see any reason why you really want to do this. But Bob is going to tell me why I'm wrong. Right. Mm-hmm. I will. So Bob, what Bob is saying is that here you don't actually have to. You can just get the idea of the, you can just use the idea of this button, and then stick it into it and stick it in. I would say that you can do things just about as simply without, in just about as neatly in other ways. And this is perhaps style, but I would avoid this. I would personally avoid this like the plague. Yes.
I guess the point there is that if I understand Bob correctly,
Right.
that way is totally dynamic because if you create a list on
Mhm.
the fly
Right.
somewhere and then redraw and the list X then becomes 2 buttons or 20 buttons,
Mm-hmm.
the code stays the same and the routine only has to be able to deal with the dynamic number of buttons.
Sure,
Whereas
but
if you create the names,
right.
you hard-coded 20 names, you need 21.
Sure. No, but no, but that's wrong actually, because I can put this code inside a list and just keep redefining button to be what I want it to be. I don't have to save that if I don't need it. And if I want to, I can get one extra call, get the ID, and save it if I do need a list of IDs. So I think that given any example, I can come up with something that's just about as clean, has basically the same number of lines, and doesn't use this. I really like the explicitness of this. It really connects the idea. Again, I mean, reasonable people can disagree, but I think this really gets across the idea, what am I doing the bind to? And if I don't need this button any further once I've done the binding, I don't need to save the name. I mean, you could even actually do WX button and then put .bind right at the end if you wanted to. I wouldn't recommend that because it's getting a little messy, but you can do that if you want to. Okay. All right. And that brings us to what I wasn't going to do today, but since it was brought up, let's talk a little bit about widget IDs. Okay. Everything we've created has had a -1 in here, and I haven't explained why. Okay. Every widget we create needs to have a unique identifier. And most of the time, we don't care what that identifier is. Okay? However, so the easiest thing to do is to get Python to give it that, to get WX Python to give it a unique number as we need it. So by passing it that -1, it just simply says, I don't know what the ID number is going to be. And it'll create it for you. And it'll give it a unique one. So there are other ways to do this. You can set aside a table of IDs from the beginning and then use them in your calls. And in Windows, people do that routinely, so you'll see people do that. But frankly, I don't think it's a great idea. You can also use a call WX new ID, and it'll give you. And that may be, by the way, ID may be, that second D, that D may be a lowercase letter. I'm not sure I got the capitalization correct there. But this will give you a number that hasn't been used before.
There's one other way, and that is instead of the -1, you put WX ID_N. Which is the same spelling.
Which is a -1.
That's better than doing -1. Very explicit. -1.
Mm.
Editing problem for you if you make that -1 if you want to edit some other code. So WX ID underbar any is stronger code. Prevent your code from making a mistake on correcting -1.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. Okay.
I don't understand.
Okay. So what I could have done, instead of putting a -1 here,
Yeah.
I could type WX underscore WX dot
ID underbar any.
ID.
What you're using is a defined symbol.
It's a symbol.
rather than an explicit constant.
Okay.
The defined symbol belongs in that place. If you use an explicit constant,
Mm-hmm.
it runs the risk that you may make a typo and put in the wrong constant. For some editing,
If for some the difficulty is that the advantage of that of putting in the WX underscore ID any
if you leave off the minus, you got a problem.
is I leave off the minus, I've got a problem. If I go through and I replace -1 somewhere else, I might accidentally do this. If I misspell the ID any, it fails. The code fails. So I catch, which I catch.
That fails with an editor error that you can usually see. The -1 won't fail either, +1.
Right.
But once the code's correctly
Right. Right.
they function the same way.
So I appreciate what Pete is saying and what Bob is saying is correct, but I think that you will see this with the -1 in 90% of WX code.
It's an advised practice. And
Yep.
They do the same thing with other types of constants as well.
Right.
Some try to take the constants out of the methods.
Okay. So demos all the time. Yes. So when you create that static text, that label, you're probably not going to do anything else with it later. Certainly not going to create events for us. It doesn't do anything when you click on it and so on. So I don't really need to know its ID. But if I ever do want to know the ID for a widget, all I do is I call getID, and that gives me its widget, its number. So I can either create the ID and then assign it, but I think it's just as easy to ask WX to assign the widget ID and then go ask for it if I need it. Okay, so this is a good place to stop, and we'll continue. I'll review some of this and we'll go on to talk about events and then some more sophisticated aspects of doing callbacks next week. Any questions before everybody leaves? Yes. Yes, you know what? That's a good question. Can I get some help from somebody in Claude's group? And you're going to, okay. This will get up on the website as soon as two things happen. One of which is that I make the PDFs and write out some text. And then as soon as John after that can get to putting it up on the site. Yes, I will try. I apologize for that. Okay. Next, the other thing is, when can this stuff get onto YouTube? These talks get onto YouTube, and the answer to that again has two parts. One of which is that I need to edit them, and then I need to find somebody who knows how to get them onto YouTube, and that may require a hire, since we've lost Jonas. Okay. They don't know the APS password to YouTube. But actually, I shouldn't say that categorically.